I let my daughter bully my stepdaughter until she forced her to eat allergic food to impress friends. The school suspended her, but instead of supporting me, my entitled husband demanded more punishment, so I grounded my stepdaughter for starting it all. My stepdaughter almost died because of my daughter. I need to say that first because for 3 months I refused to say it. I said incident, I said misunderstanding, I said things got out of hand. I wrapped it in every soft word I could find because the hard words, my daughter force-fed her stepsister food she was allergic to, were too ugly to hold in my mouth. But I'm holding them now. She could have died. Her throat closed. They used an EpiPen in the school nurse's office. An ambulance came. She was 12 years old, lying on a stretcher with hives covering her face, struggling to breathe, because my 15-year-old daughter wanted to look tough in front of her friends. And when the school called me, when they told me what happened, when they said my daughter was being suspended, my first thought wasn't, is Elizabeth okay? Elizabeth is my stepdaughter. My first thought was, this is going to ruin Zoe's record. Zoe is my biological daughter. That thought. That sick, reflexive, maternal priority that put my daughter's transcript above my stepdaughter's airway. That's the thought that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman I was. And if I'm being honest, the kind of woman I still have to fight every day not to be. Let me explain the family. Because blended families are complicated and I used that complexity as a shield for years, and I need to strip it away so you can see what was really happening underneath. My name is Nicole. I'm 43. I married Zach when I was 36. Zach is 45. He has a daughter from his first marriage, Elizabeth, who is 12 now, 11 when this happened. I have a daughter from mine, Zoe, who is 15 now, 14 when this happened. Zach's first wife passed away when Elizabeth was 4. Cancer. Elizabeth doesn't remember her mother in the way older kids remember. She remembers warmth. She remembers a voice. She has photos. Zach kept the memory alive carefully, respectfully, in the way that a good father does when he's trying to give his daughter something death took away. When I entered their lives, Elizabeth was 8. She was shy, gentle, the kind of child who draws pictures of flowers and leaves them on your pillow without saying anything. She wanted to love me. She tried so hard to love me. And I let her try while giving her almost nothing in return. I need to be honest about that. I was not a good stepmother. Not abusive. Not neglectful in any documentable way. But emotionally, I rationed my affection like it was a finite resource, and Elizabeth was always last in line. Zoe got the first hug when I came home. Zoe's school events got priority on the calendar. Zoe's preferences shaped dinner menus, vacation plans, movie choices. When Elizabeth had a dance recital and Zoe had a volleyball game on the same night, I went to the volleyball game and Zach went to the recital alone. I told myself it was logistics. 2 events, 2 parents, divide and conquer. But I never once went to Elizabeth's event over Zoe's. Not once in 3 years. And Elizabeth noticed. Children always notice. They count. They keep a ledger that adults think is invisible, and it's not. Elizabeth knew she was second. She lived in second place in her own house, in the family her father had built for her, and the woman who was supposed to fill the space her mother left had decided, quietly and completely, that the space wasn't worth filling. Zoe. Let me tell you about Zoe because she's my daughter and I love her, and that love blinded me to things I should have seen years before the allergy incident. Zoe is strong-willed. Confident. Loud. She walks into rooms and takes up space the way I always wished I could. She's popular at school. She has a wide social circle. She's the kind of teenager who sets the tone for the group, and the group follows. I admired that about her. I saw her social dominance as leadership. What I didn't see, what I chose not to see, was that dominance and leadership are not the same thing. Dominance requires someone underneath. And in our house, the person underneath was Elizabeth. The bullying didn't start big. It started with exclusion. Zoe would have friends over and close her door. Elizabeth would knock and Zoe would say, loudly enough for her friends to hear, "This is a private hangout." Elizabeth would go to her room. I'd hear it happen from the kitchen and I'd think, that's normal sibling stuff. It wasn't normal. It was a 15-year-old establishing hierarchy in front of an audience and an 11-year-old learning her place. It escalated. Zoe started making comments about Elizabeth at the dinner table. Small, surgical comments disguised as jokes. "Elizabeth, why do you always eat like that? Elizabeth, your hair looks weird today. Elizabeth, do you even have friends at school or do you just sit alone?" Each one delivered with a smile. Each one followed by a glance at me, checking to see if I'd react. I didn't. I'd change the subject. I'd say, "Zoe, be nice," in a tone so light it communicated nothing. Zach would stiffen across the table. He'd say, "That's not appropriate." And Zoe would roll her eyes and I'd say, she didn't mean it, and Zach would look at me with an expression I refused to decode because decoding it would have meant admitting that my daughter was a bully and I was her enabler. Elizabeth's allergies. This is critical. Elizabeth has a severe tree nut allergy. Diagnosed at age 3. Confirmed by multiple allergists. She carries an EpiPen everywhere. The school has one on file. Zach and I both signed forms at the beginning of every school year listing her allergy, the symptoms, the protocol. It was not a secret. It was not ambiguous. Everyone in our household knew. Zoe knew. She'd known since she moved in. She'd watched Elizabeth check ingredient labels at every meal. She'd watched Zach read restaurant menus with Elizabeth, pointing out what was safe and what wasn't. She'd been present for at least 2 conversations where Zach explained to visitors that certain foods couldn't be in the house because of Elizabeth's allergy. Zoe knew. Remember that. Because what comes next only makes sense if you understand that my daughter didn't act out of ignorance. She acted out of cruelty. And I have to live with the fact that the cruelty grew in a house where I was the one tending the soil. The incident happened on a Tuesday at school. Lunchtime. Zoe was a freshman. Elizabeth was a 6th grader at the same school, a combined middle and high school campus. They shared a cafeteria. Zoe was sitting with her friend group. Elizabeth was sitting 2 tables away with her own friends. According to the school's investigation, and I've read the report 3 times, what happened was this. Zoe's friend group had been doing a social media challenge. The kind of stupid, dangerous thing teenagers do because their brains aren't finished developing and consequences are abstract. The challenge involved getting someone to eat something they didn't want to eat. Peer pressure content. Funny reactions. Views and likes. Zoe told her friends she could get Elizabeth to eat a cookie that contained almonds. She said it casually. Like it was a dare. Like it was content. She walked over to Elizabeth's table with a cookie wrapped in a napkin and said, in front of Elizabeth's friends, "Hey Elizabeth, try this." "Mom made them," Elizabeth said. "What's in it?" Zoe said, "Just chocolate chip. No nuts." I checked. Elizabeth looked at the cookie. She looked at Zoe. And here's the part that destroys me every time I think about it. Elizabeth took the cookie because Zoe, her stepsister, the older girl in her house, told her it was safe. Elizabeth trusted her. Despite the comments. Despite the exclusion. Despite everything. Elizabeth still trusted Zoe enough to eat something she handed her because Zoe said their mother had made it. She trusted the family. And the family poisoned her. Elizabeth bit into the cookie. Within minutes, her lips started swelling. Her throat tightened. Her skin broke out in hives. One of Elizabeth's friends ran to the cafeteria monitor. The nurse was called. The EpiPen was administered. An ambulance was called. Elizabeth was taken to the hospital. By the time Zach and I arrived, she was stable but swollen, lying in a hospital bed with an 4 in her arm and a look on her face that I will never be able to describe because it wasn't pain and it wasn't fear. It was understanding. The face of an 11-year-old girl who just understood, fully and permanently, that her stepsister had tried to hurt her on purpose and nobody was going to protect her. Zach was shaking. Not with fear. With rage. A quiet, compressed rage that I'd never seen in him before. He stood at Elizabeth's bedside holding her hand and he looked at me and said, "Where is Zoe?" I said, "The school has her in the office." He said, "What happened?" I said, "There was a cookie." Zoe says she didn't know it had nuts. He said, "Zoe knew." 3 words. No hesitation. He didn't need the investigation. He didn't need the report. He knew his stepdaughter. He knew the pattern. He knew. I said, "We don't know that for sure." Zach looked at me. The way he looked at me in that moment is something I carry in my chest like a stone. It wasn't anger at me. Not yet. It was the beginning of a realization. The first flicker of a man understanding that the woman he married was not going to protect his daughter. That I was going to protect mine. Even now. Even with Elizabeth in a hospital bed. The school's investigation took 2 days. They interviewed Zoe, her friends, Elizabeth's friends, the cafeteria monitor, and reviewed the security camera footage from the cafeteria. The findings were unambiguous. Zoe had knowingly given Elizabeth a cookie containing almonds. She had lied about the ingredients. She had done it in the context of a social media challenge. One of her friends had been filming. The video was on someone's phone. Zoe was suspended for 10 days. The school also referred the matter to the district's threat assessment team because the incident involved a known, life-threatening allergy. When the principal called me to explain the suspension, my first words were, 10 days seems excessive for a prank. The principal went silent for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, your stepdaughter was taken from this school in an ambulance. This was not a prank. This was an act of deliberate harm against a student with a documented medical condition. 10 days is the minimum. I heard the words. They didn't penetrate. I was still in protection mode. I was still operating from the place inside me that says Zoe comes first, Zoe is my blood, Zoe is the one I have to defend. That place had been running the show for so long that I didn't know how to turn it off, even when the evidence was an 11-year-old in a hospital gown. Zoe came home that afternoon. She was defiant. Not remorseful. Not scared. Defiant. She said, it was just a joke. Everyone does the challenge. Elizabeth overreacted, she said overreacted about a girl whose throat closed. I should have stopped her right there. I should have sat her down and said, you could have killed her. Do you understand that? I didn't. I said, we'll deal with the school. Just stay off social media. That was my parenting response. Not accountability. Not consequences. Damage control. Zach came home from the hospital that evening. Elizabeth was discharged but staying with Zach's mother for the night because Zach didn't want her in the house with Zoe. He walked through the door and he was a different man than the one who had left that morning. The rage was no longer compressed. It was organized. He sat at the kitchen table and he said, Zoe is grounded for the rest of the semester. No phone. No social media. No friends over. She writes a letter of apology to Elizabeth. She writes a letter of apology to the school. And she's going to attend a session with Elizabeth's therapist to understand the impact of what she did. I said, that's too much. Zach said, too much? She poisoned my daughter. I said, she didn't poison her. It was a prank that went wrong. Zach stood up. He put both hands on the table. He leaned forward. He said, Nicole, your daughter knew about the allergy. She lied about the ingredients. She did it for social media. My daughter was in an ambulance. This is not a prank. This is assault. And if you can't see that, then we have a much bigger problem than Zoe's punishment. I should have agreed. I should have said, you're right. I'm sorry. Whatever you think is appropriate, I'll support it. But I didn't. Because the voice inside me, the one that had been choosing Zoe over Elizabeth since the day I moved into this house, said something else. The voice said, Elizabeth must have done something to provoke it. The voice said, there's always two sides. The voice said, Zoe wouldn't just do this for no reason. And I listened to that voice because listening to it was easier than confronting the truth that my daughter had become someone capable of hurting a child and I had helped create her. I said, I think Elizabeth might have provoked it. They've had tension for months. Maybe Elizabeth said something that set Zoe off. Zach's face changed. Something behind his eyes shifted from anger to something colder and more permanent. He said, very quietly, you're blaming my daughter? The one who was in the hospital? I said, I'm not blaming her. I'm saying there might be context we're not seeing. He said, the context is that your daughter fed mine an allergen. There is no other context. And then I did the thing that I cannot take back. The thing that ended my marriage. The thing that told Zach, Elizabeth, and eventually Zoe exactly who I was and what I valued. I grounded Elizabeth. I grounded the victim. I said, until we figure out what really happened, I think both girls should be restricted. I took Elizabeth's tablet privileges. I told Zach that Elizabeth needed to take responsibility for her part in the conflict. I framed a near-fatal allergic reaction as a conflict with two sides and I punished the child who'd been harmed because punishing her felt safer than admitting that my child was the one who deserved every consequence coming her way. Zach looked at me for a long time. Then he said, I'm taking Elizabeth. We're going to my mother's. Don't call me tonight. He packed a bag. He packed Elizabeth's things. He walked out the door. I stood in the kitchen and I told myself he was overreacting. I told myself he'd cool down. I told myself this would blow over. It didn't blow over. It blew up. Zach didn't come back that night. Or the next night. Or the next. He texted me once on day 2, I'm consulting a lawyer. We need to talk about separation. 11 words. The second time in a story that 11 words have destroyed a life. I stared at the text and I thought, he's bluffing. He's emotional. He'll come back. He always comes back. But Zach wasn't the kind of man who bluffed. Zach was the kind of man who said what he meant and did what he said, and I'd spent 7 years mistaking his patience for passivity and his gentleness for weakness. He wasn't passive. He wasn't weak. He was a man who had given me every chance to be the partner he needed and the stepmother his daughter deserved, and I had failed on both counts, and the failure had put his child in a hospital bed. The school's threat assessment team completed their review within a week. The findings went beyond the suspension. They recommended that Zoe attend mandatory counseling, that the families of both students participate in a mediated conference, and that the incident be formally documented in Zoe's student file. They also flagged it for potential referral to local law enforcement. Law enforcement. When I heard that, the defense mechanism I'd been operating behind finally cracked. Not because I was suddenly empathetic toward Elizabeth. Because I was terrified for Zoe. A charge. A record. A 15-year-old with a juvenile referral for what the school was now calling reckless endangerment of a student with a known medical condition. My daughter. My bright, confident, popular daughter. With a record. I called Zach. He answered. The conversation lasted 8 minutes, and it was the most clarifying 8 minutes of my life. I said, the school is talking about law enforcement. Zach, we can't let this go on Zoe's record. She's 14, he said. Nicole, she could have killed Elizabeth. I said, she didn't mean to hurt her that badly. He said, she lied about the ingredients. She knew about the allergy? Intent doesn't require a specific outcome. She intended to make Elizabeth eat something she was allergic to. That's enough, I said. She's a child. He said, Elizabeth is also a child. A younger one. One who trusted her stepsister. One who is now afraid to eat food she didn't prepare herself. One who wakes up at night and checks her throat because she's afraid it's closing again. Your daughter did that. And your response was to ground mine. That last sentence. Your response was to ground mine. I heard it and something inside me collapsed. Not slowly. All at once. Like a building that's been structurally compromised for years and finally gives into gravity. I heard it and I knew. I knew that everything Zach was saying was true. I knew that I had grounded a child who was in a hospital. I knew that I had blamed a victim. I knew that I had prioritized my daughter's reputation over another child's life. I knew all of it. And I also knew, with a clarity that was almost physical, that I had been building toward this moment for years. Every time I chose Zoe's volleyball game over Elizabeth's recital. Every time I let a cruel comment slide at the dinner table. Every time I said she didn't mean it instead of that was wrong. Every small choice had been a brick in a wall, and the wall had finally gotten tall enough to block out the sun. I said, Zach, I'm sorry, he said, I know you are. But sorry doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change the fact that I can't trust you to protect my daughter. You had 3 years of chances. 3 years of small moments where you could have stepped in and didn't. And when the big moment came, you punished Elizabeth. He paused. Then he said, I need to protect my child. And I can't do that in a house where her stepmother sees her as the problem. Zach filed for divorce the following week. We'd been married for 7 years. The proceedings were straightforward because neither of us wanted to fight. He didn't ask for anything unreasonable. He wanted primary custody of Elizabeth, which he was always going to get because Elizabeth was his biological daughter, and I had no legal claim. He wanted the house sold and the equity split. He wanted a clean break. I agreed to everything because I didn't have the standing to contest anything. What was I going to argue? That I deserved more time in the house where I'd let my daughter bully his daughter for 3 years and then punish the victim when it nearly turned fatal? Elizabeth. Let me tell you about Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't speak to me after the incident. Not a word. When Zach came to collect the rest of their things, Elizabeth sat in the car. She didn't come inside. She didn't look at the house. She sat in the passenger seat with her seatbelt on and her hands in her lap, staring forward, and I stood at the window and watched her and I thought, I did that. I made that child afraid of her own home. I made her afraid of the dinner table. I made her afraid of the kitchen, of the couch, of the hallways where Zoe would say things and I would say nothing. I took a child who drew flowers and left them on my pillow and I taught her that love in this house came with conditions, and the primary condition was don't be more important than Zoe. Zach told me, months later during one of our brief co-parenting communications about the divorce logistics, that Elizabeth was in therapy twice a week. She had developed a food anxiety that went beyond her allergy. She was afraid of eating anything she hadn't personally prepared or watched being prepared. She'd lost weight. She'd stopped eating lunch at school because she didn't trust the cafeteria. She'd had 2 panic attacks in the first month after the incident, both triggered by being offered food by someone other than Zach or his mother. She was 11 years old and she was afraid of food. Because my daughter had used food as a weapon. And I had let the conditions for that weapon to be built, loaded, and fired develop in my own house for 3 years without doing a thing about it. Zoe. Let me tell you what happened to Zoe. The law enforcement referral went through. A juvenile officer reviewed the case. After consultation with the school, the hospital report, and the families, the decision was made not to file formal charges but to place Zoe in a diversion program. The program included mandatory counseling, community service, and a behavioral contract. If she completed it successfully, there would be no permanent record. She completed it. Technically. She attended the sessions. She did the hours. She signed the contract. But Zoe didn't change. Not really. Not in the way that matters. She was compliant, not remorseful. She performed the program the way she performed everything, with a minimum effort required to get through it and move on. But the social consequences were another matter entirely. The video from the cafeteria, the one her friend had been filming, circulated. Not publicly. Within the school. Students saw it. Parents heard about it. The story spread the way stories spread in school communities, fast, distorted, and permanent. Zoe went from being the popular girl to being the girl who poisoned her stepsister. Her friend group fractured. The girl who had filmed the video distanced herself immediately. 2 other friends stopped sitting with Zoe at lunch. By the end of the suspension, Zoe's social circle had contracted from 12 people to 3, and the 3 who remained weren't friends. They were just the only ones who hadn't left. Zoe blamed me. She said, "You didn't protect me. You let them ruin my life." And I heard the echo of my own parenting in her words. She'd learned from me that when things go wrong, you protect yourself first. You blame the other person. You reframe the situation so you're the victim. She watched me do it her entire life. She watched me dismiss Elizabeth's pain. She watched me minimize her own cruelty. She watched me ground the wrong child. And she internalized all of it. She became, at 14, a smaller version of the worst parts of me. And when the consequences of that finally landed, she turned to me for the same thing I'd always given her, protection without accountability. And this time, I couldn't give it. Because the school was involved. The law was involved. Reality had finally outweighed my ability to shield her from it. I put Zoe in therapy. Real therapy. Not the diversion program counseling. A private therapist who specializes in adolescent behavioral issues. It's been 10 months. The progress is slow. Zoe is still, at her core, a girl who believes the world owes her something and that other people's pain is a minor inconvenience when it conflicts with her comfort. She got that from me. Not from her father. Not from school. From me. From watching me choose her over Elizabeth 1,000 times and absorb the message that she was more important. She internalized that hierarchy and she enforced it. What happened in the cafeteria wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of a power dynamic that I created and maintained and refused to address until the child was in an ambulance. I live alone now. A 2-bedroom apartment. Zoe splits time between me and her father, my ex-husband from my first marriage. Zach and Elizabeth are gone. Zach sold the house. He moved to a different school district so Elizabeth could start fresh. I agreed to that too because what else could I do? Tell a judge I wanted the child I'd failed to remain in the district where she'd been hospitalized? I tried to write Elizabeth a letter. 4 times. Each time I started, I couldn't find words that didn't sound like excuses. I'm sorry I wasn't a better stepmother. Too generic. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. Too late. I'm sorry I grounded you when you were the one who was hurt. True, but saying it on paper felt like asking for absolution I hadn't earned. I never sent the letter. Maybe I should have. Maybe the words didn't need to be perfect. Maybe Elizabeth just needed to know that someone in that house finally saw what happened from her side. But I was afraid. Afraid that the letter would come back unopened, like Rochelle's in another story. Afraid that Elizabeth would read it and feel nothing because she'd already learned to expect nothing from me. So I said nothing. Again. The pattern holds. Zach and I speak only when necessary. Logistics. Paperwork. Final divorce details. He is polite in the way that a person is polite when they've decided the other person no longer warrants emotional investment. He doesn't ask how I'm doing. He doesn't update me on Elizabeth. I don't ask. Because asking would require me to hear about the damage, and hearing about the damage would require me to feel it, and feeling it might break whatever thin, brittle structure I've built to get through the days. My mother told me I made mistakes. That's her word. Mistakes. Like I forgot to pick up milk. Like I missed a dentist appointment. My mother doesn't understand that what I did wasn't a mistake. A mistake is accidental. What I did was systematic. I systematically favored one child over another. I systematically enabled cruelty. I systematically punished the victim. And when I was confronted with the consequences, I systematically chose to protect the wrong person. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern. And patterns don't form by accident. They form because someone lays each brick deliberately, one at a time, while telling themselves they're building a wall when they're really building a cage. Elizabeth draws flowers. Zach told me that once, early in the separation, before the conversations became purely transactional. He said Elizabeth was drawing again. Flowers. The same flowers she used to leave on my pillow. He said she was drawing them for her grandmother now. Not for me. She transferred that tenderness, that small, quiet act of love, to someone who deserved it. Someone who hadn't spent 3 years rationing affection. Someone who hadn't grounded her for being bullied. Someone who hadn't stood in a doorway and done nothing while her stepsister tore her down one comment at a time. I think about those flowers every day. The ones she used to leave on my pillow. She'd draw them in colored pencil. Sunflowers, mostly. Sometimes daisies. She'd fold the paper in half and write for Nicole on the front. Not Mom. She never called me Mom. She called me Nicole. And I never corrected her. I never said, "You can call me Mom if you want." I never invited her that close. I kept her at a distance that was comfortable for me and devastating for her, and she still drew me flowers anyway. She still tried. An 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old, still trying to earn the love of a woman who had already decided it wasn't available. Those flowers are the thing I can't get past. Not the hospital. Not the divorce. Not Zoe's diversion program. The flowers. The quiet, persistent hope of a child who kept offering love to someone who wouldn't take it. That's what I rejected. Not just Elizabeth. Her hope. Her trust. Her belief that if she just kept trying, the woman in her house would eventually love her back. I didn't love her back. And by the time I was ready to, she was gone. In another house. In another school. Drawing flowers for someone else. I'm 43 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with a daughter who is learning, slowly and painfully, that the world does not organize itself around her comfort. I have a divorce decree. I have a therapist. I have a job that pays the bills. I have the quiet, relentless knowledge that I had 2 children in my care, and I protected one at the expense of the other, and the one I failed to protect will carry what I allowed to happen to her for the rest of her life. There's no redemption in this story. I know that. I don't get to write a letter and fix it. I don't get to show up with flowers of my own and undo 3 years of favoritism and 1 afternoon of a hospital bed. I don't get to rewind to the first time Zoe said something cruel at the dinner table and say, "That's enough. You will not speak to your sister that way." I don't get to go back to the day I moved into Zach's house and choose, from the very beginning, to love both children equally instead of treating one like my daughter and the other like an inconvenience who came with the house. I don't get any of that. All I get is this, the truth. Written down. Ugly and whole in mine. I chose my daughter over my stepdaughter. My daughter almost killed her. The school punished the right child. I punished the wrong one. My husband left. My stepdaughter is afraid of food. My daughter is in therapy for behavioral issues I nurtured. And I'm sitting in a 2-bedroom apartment at 1 a.m. writing this because the silence is too loud and the flowers are gone, and I can still see Elizabeth's face in that hospital bed. Not the pain. Not the hives. Not the swelling. The understanding. The look of an 11-year-old girl who finally understood that nobody in her house was going to choose her. That look is my mirror. And I can't stop staring into it.